I first got introduced to Asher's work. I was out to dinner with my wife and a couple that we're friends with, and every time there was a lull in the conversation, one or both of them would pull out their phones and start doing this. And it was super rude. And so eventually I was like, what's going on? And one of them was like, oh, we're totally addicted to this game Threes. You got to try it out. And they handed the phone to my wife. And then they didn't get their phone back until the end of dinner. And I've only seen this happen with my wife twice before. And the first time was when she first got introduced to Drop 7. And the second time was when we were actually... Zach had been working on Spell Tower for like a week at that point, and it was like a very early build. And it was like, hey, try my game, as Zach is wont to do. And then only Lauren got to try the game because everybody else didn't get a chance because she played it all throughout dinner again. So I immediately knew that Threes was like a deep, interesting game that was super interesting and I would super get into if I played it. And then I immediately decided I did not want to play that game because I would not be productive for a very long time and I should avoid it like the plague. And so I was super excited when I found out that we were going to have Asher here speaking and that I was going to be introducing him because by that point I had read his blog and I saw that he was really smart and not only a good designer but someone who could talk intelligently about game design and get deep on it and really talk about interesting stuff. But it was sort of a mixed blessing because it meant I now had to play Threes. And so I got pretty addicted to Threes, but now I've got it under control. It's a managed habit now. And so Asher's going to be talking about Threes. He's going to talk about how it affected his design process coming up with that game. Also talking about Puzzle Juice, another game of his that has influenced his design process and how it has influenced the game that we're now showing out there, Close Castles, which unfortunately for me, I think is coming out soon, which means I'm going to get addicted again. So join me in welcoming Asher Vollmer.
Minimalism. Is this? Can you hear me? All right, good. Sorry. Minimalism. The thing about minimalism is that it looks very simple, but it's more complicated than it looks. Thank you for your time. Do you have any questions? All right, I got a real talk. Sorry about that. So Matt introduced me. My name's Asher, and I've made these games. I made Puzzle Juice in the past. I made Threes, which is the game that he was talking about, and then my next game, Close Castles. And you know, I feel I'm excited to give this talk, but I still feel pretty green because this is basically it. This is my work. This is what I've done. I did some projects in school. Yeah. And they look like this. But the thing about so you'll notice that all these games are like very simple, bright colors. They're on grids, and I've come to accept the fact that I'm a minimalist designer and I like embracing minimalism. But this sort of happened to me on accident. The thing is that my ideal team size is about that, where I like to program and I like to design, maybe work with one artist and one musician, and that's kind of like perfect for me. That's where I like love to shine because programming and designing I think are like super intertwined, and so the reason that minimalism works for me is because we're such a small team, and I worked on Puzzle Juice, which was just too much stuff. There were 4 game modes, 7 power-ups, and 21 objectives, all of which I had to implement and test, and was draining and like killed me. And I was like, you know what, I can't do this. Also, side note, all of these things, the objectives and the power-ups, all felt like crutches to the game design. Like the game basically couldn't hold itself up by itself, so I had to add these things on top of it, and that was pretty disappointing for a lot of reasons. I still like Puzzle Juice. I think it's a good game, but in hindsight, I'm seeing all these problems with it. And also like like I said, implementing all this stuff was just too much work. So the reason that Threes is minimal, and I strived, I was like, this is going to be a tiny little game, was because of Puzzle Juice. And I was like, I don't want to implement all that stuff. let's just do that. And so because of that, because I approached the whole game with that attitude, like it's going to be tiny, everything's about to be tiny, we're going to tell people it's tiny, it just ended up being very minimal. Yeah, so what is minimalism, you might ask? The thing about minimalism is that it looks very simple, but it's more complicated than it looks. Thank you for your time. Basically, the thing about minimalism, the things that you're trying to do in minimalism, is you're trying to make things small, simple, and elegant. Those are your goals: small, simple, elegant, which worked perfectly with threes. But the thing about these is they're all goals, and they're not like they're super helpful. Like they can sort of help you with your decisions. You're like, all right, this is more, and we're aiming for less, so let's not do that. You can make that sort of stuff, but it's not like super helpful. Especially elegance is like a weird term that no one really can wrap their head around. They're like, they look at a system like, that's really elegant system, or they look at a system like, that's incredibly complicated, and I don't know what to do with it. So I've been thinking a lot about this subject, and but like Zach, I'm not an academic. I don't know what I'm doing. This is all anecdotal and based on my personal experience. But I think what elegance is the resistance to compartmentalize things. So I'm going to bold that. And basically, it means that all the features of the game are closely intertwined with each other. They're not in their own compartments. As a counterexample, I'm going to show off maximalism, which is a term that's not even real. And I live in LA. I hang around a lot of big studios. Specifically, my next door neighbor works at Riot, so I'm going to talk about like how he talks about Riot. And this is not a bad thing. Like this is just a different way of working. This is just not minimalism. So, but like for example, how Riot works is that they actually want to compartmentalize things as much as possible because it lets them be a giant company. Except in a giant company, compartments are called departments. And so you'll have like the game design department, and they make the characters, and they balance them, and they figure out the late game, like how it's going to work in tournament settings, and they care about all of these things. And then you have another department, which is the visual design department, who cares about how things looks and works on skins and makes the environment look good and handles, the visual design of it. And they talk to each other. There's communication there. They come, like if a game design wants to make a character, they'll go to the visual design studio, the visual design department, and be like, hey, we want to make this character. It has a lot of health points. The visual designers are like, okay, let's make her a tank. I was like, okay, cool. And then they go back to their jobs and they put their nose to the grindstones, and then they don't, they'll talk, but they're literally 2 stories apart, so they don't really see each other that much. And the cool thing about this is that they can put hundreds of people in each of these departments, and they're all working closely together, but they're just separate. And then you can have things like have a whole team that works on skins and doesn't have to care about the high-level gameplay or like how tournament settings, because they can focus on making characters look cool because that's their job, and they don't have to worry about other stuff. And basically, not worrying about things is like how these big companies survive, is just keeping all their employees, separate and sane. And the cool thing about these departments is that they're scalable. You can always have a story department that talks to them and figures out how to integrate the story into the design, the visual design, and accessibility, who's looking about how new players can approach it, how new players will interact with the story, how new players will handle the visual input of all this stuff. And it could like scale infinitely, I guess. Not that you'd really want that. But the thing is that I'm just a finite team. This is my ideal. And that there's less team members there than theoretical departments in this theoretical company I made up. So I'm striving for elegance in this department. And if for example you went to all of these departments and you said to them, hey, all of you, let's be elegant. Let's be small, simple, and elegant. All of you do that. All right, let's do it. Here we go. It's like it's like, okay, there's still all of these separate places all communicating like across great distances to talk to each other. And that's not really, that's not elegant. It's probably it's simpler, and it's probably how Apple works. Probably Apple has like incredibly few employees for the amount of work and cool stuff they do, so they probably look something like this. So it's not a bad structure at all. But for me and a small team, it's not at all what I want. So obviously the problem is the connections and like the way that they're all separated. So you got to bring them all together, and you just have to smush them together to the point where that the decisions you're making in each of these departments, they're not just informing each other, but they are each other, to the point where a game design decision is a story decision, is a visual design decision, is an accessibility decision. Where like that's all the same thing. And it's great for small teams. A good example of what could go in the middle there is the tutorial, like Zach was talking about, because it will affect all of those things. And so I believe that the concept of striving for elegance, I gotta slow down. Sorry, I'm all excited. The concept of striving for elegance is basically finding work that fits in that overlap, is making sure that the things that you're working on and the decisions that you're making fit in there, and then just ripple outwards and affect all the components of your game. For example, let's do some concrete, like real examples, is Threes, my game. I think that where we ended up, we have a pretty good overlap of the visual design and the game design. You'll notice, like, basically if you look at this board and squint and fuzz your eyes, you can still make out what the important parts of the game are. One of my goals as a game designer was that Threes should be as mobile as possible, which means you should be able to take it out of your pocket, press one button, and then look at the screen, and within less than a second, understand what's happening, and then make an informed decision about how to move forward. That was like a main goal of Threes, to be mobile. So it had to be very digestible at all times and very understandable. So you can see here that the 1s and 2s are unique to whatever the 3s are, and you can see the order that the 3s ascend, and the highest numbers are highlighted. Like, these are your focal points. You want to get those numbers together or increase those numbers. And this actually comes from a year of hard work with my artist. You can actually go online and find the emails between me and my artist Greg, where we worked for a whole year trying to iron this out, because this wasn't always the case where the game design and the visual design were so closely intermingled. At one point, they were very separate. So there was a point where, so I had just designed the game, the interesting part. I had just figured out the matching and the basic system and premise behind Threes. I'm like, this is really cool, Greg. And what's especially cool is that it's such a solid system that you can put whatever you want on the tiles. And the system will support it. And you have total free expression. And he's like, cool. I came up with these monsters. And aesthetic differences aside, they're not super clear. They basically they don't have numbers on them. That's the problem. They don't. It's hard to tell what monster leads into what monster leads into what monster. And on top of that, the black background's much more oppressive, and it makes me feel bad to look at it. And I had a very basic prototype of the game, the one that I showed you earlier, just tiles and numbers on them. And I had friends who had played that, and then I gave them this. The reason that I sort of figured out something was going wrong is that I gave them this version, and then their feedback was like, "Oh, I hate this game now." I was like, "Well, it's the same game. You liked it before." And I was like, "Well, it's like trying to read hieroglyphics." And I was like, "Oh yeah, it totally is." It's like, I don't know. I had this idea oh, when you're playing Threes, you should look like a savant. You should look like you're peering into the matrix and understand what you're doing and manipulating it. And your friend should look over your shoulder and be like, "Look at that guy who's a savant." I don't know why that was a goal. That goal went away. But yeah, like I was saying, it became clear that the tiles need to have numbers on them. And so the fact that numbers are on the tiles fits into this overlapping space of the game design that I was striving for, and the visual design that the players were going to be interacting with. But at the same time, there's all that space outside of the overlap, and it's basically the half of the tiles that didn't have numbers on them, and that was the space where I could tell Greg, hey, you can do whatever you want there. You can have fun, go nuts, and he did, and he made up these little characters with their cool little personalities, and they're all different, and like that was cool once I identified the space that he should be playing in, and yeah, so that was like a really cool revelation. So I'm talking about all of these. I've been describing this all in terms of like all the disciplines, mostly because I want to make it clear, and I've seen a lot of like indie developers misstep on like sort of treating the game design like all they work on all the time, and then everything else they just sort of tack on at the very end, and they're like, all right, cool. So I'm showing it like this to make it show how important it is that all of these things are part of game design, and you can't really just neglect them and forget about them and throw them away. You have to be thinking about them, at least in a minimalist game. You have to be thinking about them at all times. And basically, you're striving for overlapping systems. So yeah, in the game design itself, you can strive for overlapping systems using the same Venn diagram thing I've been showing this whole time. So for example, in threes, the main thing you do is you shift tiles. They move in a direction, one of the 4 directions, up, down, left, right. And that's pretty, I had that first thing. I was like, cool, what do you do now? And then merging was like 1 + 2 = 3. That was the first mechanic that I came up with. I had this grid, numbers moving around, 1 + 2 = 3. And it all, these 2 things are overlapping. They work together because when you shift, some tiles can merge into others and some cannot. And so they're overlapping. They're both happening at the same time. When they're, like, shifting has the repercussion of merging. And then there's also spawning. So shifting has the repercussion of merging, and also new tiles spawn on the board with very specific rules. Every swipe caused all of these things to happen. And basically, in my opinion, in minimalist games, the more linked verbs, the more you can overload a verb. This sounds really risky and terrible advice, but it seems it's fun, and it's the fun side to error on, where you just overload verbs and make one thing affect a lot of other things. This is terrible advice for programming. Like, if you've ever been a programmer, you want to like compartmentalize things and make things components and make things reusable. But in game design, as a player, you're basically making these interesting challenges for players, and interesting challenges navigating the repercussions of all of these different systems. And basically, they're adding depth. Like this is at least in minimalist games that I'm interested in making. This is kind of where depth comes from, is simple verbs having lots and lots of repercussions. And you know, like at least like that's games I care about, because you can definitely have complex verbs that have complex repercussions, but that's less interesting to me. And so this is how you get depth. Accessibility is a whole other animal. And I actually had a whole other talk on that. Zach just talked about it, so I'm just talking about depth now, nice and deep. So the spawning, fun story about spawning. One of my favorite rules about how the spawning works in threes, I came up with like at the very last second when we were just doing the final balance changes. Basically, the rule for spawning is that when you shift, the new tiles will show up from the direction that you just shift from. So if you shift up, they'll show up in the bottom. If you shift left, they'll show up in the right, and so on and so forth. But so there was still a lot of randomness here, because they could show up on any of the open tiles, and that was a rule for a while. But eventually, this is documented in the emails. I was talking to Adam Zaltzman and Zach, and they found a derivative strategy where you could just shift up forever, and new tiles would always spawn, because that was how I implemented it. It was like, even if no tiles moved on the board, new tiles would jump in and spawn in. And the fact that you could do this broke the game, because you could have a perfect triangle, 2048 triangle, like in the corner, and then you would, and now in threes you have to break it. You have to I can't go anywhere because it's perfect, and you actually have to make it unperfect before you can fix it again, and that's a much more interesting problem with a lot more interesting depth. But it wasn't always like that. If it was like one of my first iterations, if it was like that, you could just swipe towards the triangle again, and you would just get a new tile because you asked for it, and you could just feed into the triangle and just sort of up and right forever, and ever and ever and ever, and then you'll just win the game instantly. So that was bad and no good. And then we had to figure out a way to fix that problem. And the main thing that fixed it was that, if no tiles move, you don't get new tiles. Nothing spawns in, and that's great. And that's how the game is today. But on top of that, like a decision that I made, that I remember I sent the decision to Adam and Zach, and they were like, okay, good, no new tiles spawning in, but I don't get this other thing you're doing, but whatever, do it. Which is that new tiles only spawn in on the rows that actually move. So if you swiped up here, they would only spawn on those 2 rows because those are the only ones that are moving. If I just left it like my old system, it would show up on any of those 3 because you moved generally in that direction. But I saw an opportunity here to add more overlapping systems and like basically add a secret rule. It's a rule with no weight to the player because they don't have to notice that it's happening. So I added this rule, and it's basically because it's invisible, it only affects high-level players, which I think is really cool. And so once you get high level enough, you can start controlling where the tiles come in, and suddenly every decision is like way more interesting because if you swipe up, there are 2 options where the tile can show up. If you swipe right, there's only 1. You know exactly where the next tile is going to show up, and that's such control. And on the other hand, you could swipe the other way and get any of those 3 spots, but the next tile is a 3, so it actually might be a good idea because the 3 is there and actually have chances to merge with something. So you don't know exactly where it'll show up, but it's still a good move probably. But it's like this sort of like decisions back and forth in my head are what are making this game like suddenly a million times more interesting because I interwove the shifting mechanic and the spawning mechanic where I saw fit. And that was super exciting. Take a drink. So I had this cool system. And I think this overlapping verb system, basically verbs that are overloaded with consequences, is a really interesting tenet of a lot of games, like Spell Tower, for example. When you spell a word, not only are you spelling a word and removing the blocks, but the blocks on top of it fall down and will let you spell new words. Like Zach said, you could remove a word, like you could try to form your perfect word that you see in your mind and try to get it there by using the mechanics. Tetris is like that in the sense that you're building up this tower, but at the same time you're building opportunities for you to screw yourself over or make a nice clean for a Tetris. That's what it's called. Chess has this. Whenever you move a piece, you are drastically changing the layout of the board, like obviously because it's moved, but also you're changing where like the danger zones are. I don't know the chess terms, but where the threats are happening. And on a more advanced game, Brood War has this. StarCraft 2 has this less, which is that like whenever you place a building in Brood War, you are like taking up that spot. You're like blocking it, and you're like, I am like making sure I am changing the pathways that that units will be able to go down because I placed this building here. And that's a good example of how like these simple like verbs with lots of consequences can also be interwoven into much more complicated games. And not just minimalism. It's just that minimalist games are good at highlighting them. And this is great. I did it. I made a really cool thing. But it sucks. It was this basically this game took a year to make. And it was the problem with this method is that there's so much, like I said, you're overloading a single verb with lots of repercussions, so that every time you attach a new repercussion to a verb, it takes a lot of mental energy for you to process what that means and how it affects your game, and it's hard and you can't really think it through. So I suggest that you take like lots and lots of time if you're trying to do this sort of thing. Just lots of like little, like John Blow called it, calendar time. Take your calendar time to think about the things that you're doing and the repercussions they can have. Yeah. Sorry. And so like part of the importance of the calendar time is that I can't really show you any spreadsheets that I worked on to figure out the implications. I can't like I don't have a lot of work to show because most of it was just me in my head like fermenting on ideas and like thinking about what's my principles and what's right and what I like. And most of my revelations happened in the shower. Like they were just shower moments where I'm like, oh, they should be matching numbers to get together. And then that changed my entire life for the rest of my life because of that little shower moment. Yeah, play test a lot and take lots of showers. This is a problem in California where there's a drought. It's like, it's actually like affected me. I was like, God, I'm so stuck on this problem, but I want to save water. I'm going to shift gears real quick. You'll notice that all of my games are on grids because I love grids. And you'll notice the grids are actually getting smaller as I go. Closed Castles actually has a smaller grid for like a 2v2 game, which I think is ideal. And the reason that I love grids is because they're countable, because you can actually like look at a board and like physically like 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can like see how far apart elements are and their relationship to each other as a player, and not just like as a computer. Because of that, they're actually like intuitable to the point where after you've played the game for a while, like you don't have to count anymore. You just sort of see it and you understand it, and then at that point you can make decisions really fast. And thinking and doing become the same thing. You're like, you process instantly. Oh, it becomes routine. You process instantly. Oh, that tile is 3 tiles away, so it's gonna take 3 moves, but I'm gonna add 3 tiles. But that's okay because I've done the math at some point in my life that's worth it. So it becomes intuition and valuable. And I subscribe to the games. I believe that games are a series of interesting decisions. I think that's like a not always true, but a good like direction for the kinds of games that I like to make. And the cool thing that by making these decisions intuitable, by showing off the relationship between 2 objects and making that intuitable, these interesting decisions become informed decisions and not just like, oh, I've been thinking about this too long, I'm just going to do something. And I really value the player's time and all that stuff. And so I think grids are just 2D versions of integers, and integers are simple. I love it. I love simple things. Oh, and you'll remember, this is one of our tenets, small, simple, elegant. And it's great because what are the integers? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There you go. Helped you count. And the cool thing about those is that you understand how they fit into each other. You understand how 1 fits into 2. You understand how 1 fits into 3. You understand how 5 fits into 10. Like, they're very simple and understandable. And floats are not. What are the floats? All right, there's 1. There's 1.000000000000001. 1.00. Okay, you get it. Yeah, they're complicated and annoying, and they're much harder to figure out how they fit into each other. It's like, how many times does 0.4 go into 0.5? It's hard. And even like, how many times does 0.75 go into 1? It's like, well, I get it's 75%, but how do those values relate to each other? How many 1s does it take to make an equal amount of 75s, like 0.75s? It's hard to hold in your head. I'm not putting them on the slide just so you can do them in your heads and feel the pain, feel how much it hurts. And then integers that are high, like 17 or whatever. Okay, they're basically floats because, because how many times does 75 go into 35? You don't know. It takes time. It's not intuitable. It's hard to wrap your brain around, and it's just not fun. So in conclusion, 1 is my favorite number. 2 is my second favorite number. That's it. It's a terrible joke. So let's talk about closed castles. This is a little hazier. It's a little more up in the air because I get the joy of looking back on 3s and being like, yes, it was great. Let me tell you why. It's like I can look back on what I was thinking and how I felt and the decisions that I made along the way. but I did not know any of that. I did not know that it would work at the time. I thought it was just like these principles that I liked that I stuck to, that maybe would resonate with some other people. So I'm doing the same thing with closed castles. It is very much a different game from Threes on purpose. I don't want to even try to make another Threes in the near future. So I'm just doing this is like real-time live action strategy game where you're building castles close to each other. That's the joke. And it's on a grid because I love grids. So I asked myself, how do I make a minimalist RTS? Because I've embraced the fact that I'm a minimalist, and I want to make an RTS, and I want to take this very complicated genre and then boil it down to its elements. And so I got to think about intermingled systems, like we talked about. What can I do that's overlapping? So let's think about this. What are the systems in an RTS? There's micro, which is when you control units a lot, really fast. And then there's macro, when you're controlling the economy. So you're like, what verb can I do that will micro and also macro at the same time? And that doesn't make any sense. So we're not going to do that. So how about there's 4x, which like RTS is an extension of the 4x of explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. I'm going to change exterminate to attack because I don't care about the acronym, and it's much more understandable. Oh, and also it's a local RTS. Everyone's on the same screen. There's no hidden information. So I'm going to get rid of explore. So now I have to figure out what verb what you can do that expands and exploits and also attacks at the same time. And this is not working. So these Venn diagrams I was showing you, I don't design with them. They're just validation tools. They're things I look back on and I'm like, oh, I see. I see what I was doing and I see how it worked out and I see how it fits into it. And yes, I agree with these past decisions I made. Because when you're game designing, as you all know, you're making lots of decisions. And the worst thing, and sometimes they have to be arbitrary, but it would be nice if they're not. So I've just come up with these principles of like, it should fit all of these design restraints that I've created for myself. And that's how I, guide the decisions that I make. So here's my usual inspiration process for when I'm coming up with a game is that I figure out something that I enjoy doing in life or in games or whatever. In Threes, it was like I enjoy pulling out my phone and swiping on it. It's like just very simple pleasure, or playing with the arrow keys on my computer. But for this, I was playing StarCraft, and I was like, oh, I like building things in StarCraft. This is great. I feel like I'm building a little home, and it's good to spend my money, and I see resources going up and down. It's very satisfying. It's a very satisfying experience. And then on top of that, well, that's not like a game. It could be, I guess. But I'm also looking for a cool thing to do, so I give myself problems. I love design problems. I'm like, how do I solve this really hard problem? So I picked a really hard problem, which is that I wish StarCraft was fun. Some of you might have heard me ranting about this, about how I think StarCraft is it's built as like a pain engine. It's just misery at all times. Like if you look at this, here's a game in its very abstract form. It's like here you're having a good time. You're building your base. You're like building up. You're coming up with strategies. Like, oh, I'm gonna go lings is a term. And then you're playing up, and then you build your army, and you're like, you attack. And then Blue has a really good time there. Blue is and having the time of his life. And then Blue also won an attack here. It looks like. And then some amount of time later, the game ends. And it's not especially close to that joy that Blue had. And you'll notice that Red hasn't had fun since the beginning of the game. And it's just it's misery. It's just awful. It's like I explained it. Playing an RTS is like you're taking a math test against someone. And every time they do better on their test, your test gets harder. And every time you answer a question wrong, it also gets harder. And eventually you just give up. And when one of you gives up, it's over. That's one. So StarCraft is miserable. I don't like it, but I wish it was. So I'm gonna build around the pleasure of my game. And here's this diagram that I made up before. And so I'm gonna wash it out. And put in the thing that I enjoy doing, which is building. Building's great. Unit control, like I'm not a pro gamer in any way, in any shape or sense. So programmers might like the little micro movements of controlling the little units and macroing all that stuff. And microing. But I enjoy building stuff, and I feel like that should be the whole game. So I'm gonna try to make a game where that's all you do. And you'll notice build is a slightly more abstracted verb than swipe. Swipe is like literally finger to screen. But I think that's okay because it's a slightly more complicated game, and I've accepted that. Out the gate, I'm like, this is not going to be on an iPhone. This is going to be on a controller, and people who have controllers probably understand the concept of moving a cursor around and pressing a button. So build is the verb. And it's going to be on a grid, of course, because why wouldn't it be? This is my original prototype with my crappy temp art. And so I'm trying to think about, like, okay, what are the repercussions that building can have? Well, you spend money, obviously. You're expanding your territory. Whenever you build on the edge of your territory, it expands outward. You've expanded. And also, you're just blocking that square. That square is just now taken up by you. And you've done all of these things just by building a single building. But then there's also three kinds of buildings. There's houses, which attack. There's towers that defend. And then there's mines, which economy, which is a verb. And then this is where my model sort of gets a little weird. Like, where does the attack fit in? Where does the defend fit in? Where does the economy fit in? And so it's not a perfect model. I'm not pretending it is, but I think it's because there'll be lines between these different departments. You know, what's the attack department do? What's the defend economy do? What's the economy department do? But I think this base block of when I build things, lots of stuff should happen is good, because when I'm a new player, building stuff and the act of building things is great, and it's super fun, and I see things happen, and there are immediate rewards of seeing little hammers, and then a guy pops out, and then they walk out and they attack, and that's super satisfying. But then as I advance, I notice that it's costing me money, and I notice that it's affecting where I can build and where my enemy can build, and that it's literally just in the way of my opponent. And so I think that's good. I think that's a fun way to design. But yeah, I'm complicating minimalism. And so if it sounds like I'm stumbling around, it's because I am. But I enjoy this stuff. You know, I'm stumbling around, but I'm just trying to figure out what makes sense. So when I stumble, I try to do it with purpose. I feel like I kind of live my life like this, where one thing I do should be helping me a lot. Like giving a talk up here is helping me meet all of you guys and helping me build my self-esteem a little bit and making me a little more comfortable up here. You know, it's doing this talk is helping me out in a lot of ways, so I feel like I might as well apply it to my life. So when I'm stumbling around, I'm having a good time. And in conclusion, it's more complicated than it looks. Thanks.
Thank you, Asher. One more round of applause for Asher. So I'm going to open up with a couple of questions, then we'll open up to the audience, and I might ask a couple more questions in a minute. So at the beginning, you talked about how your ideal team size is very small. It's you and a couple other people. And I think that really gets to the heart of a lot of what we try to teach at the Game Center is that game design is game design, but also programming is game design, visual design is game design, narrative is game design. All these things, every part of the game is game design. And so you talk about these small teams. Would it be, in your mind, more ideal for you if the small team was just you? If you felt like your art was good enough that you could just do all the visual design yourself, all the sound design yourself, all the music. If that was all you, do you feel like that would be more? And by the way, your crappy placeholder art is way better than my crappy placeholder art, so you should feel better about that. But do you feel like that would be the ideal scenario for you if your skills were all at that level?
Depending on what kind of game I wanted to make, like, I think for the scale of that Threes is, which is still a small game to begin with, I would not want to have done it by myself because there was still a ton of work to do, like between the art and the promo art and the music and like and all those characters and all that stuff. I feel like I just needed other people to help me out and basically help me out in those parts of the Venn diagrams that are sticking out on the edges. So I'm happy they were there, and I'm happy I could give them a space to play around in, and it really just depends on the scale of the game. If I make a bigger game, I'm going to have to get a bigger team. So that's just a sacrifice I'm going to have to make.
How big is your team on Closed Castles?
Currently, this is a funny story. Currently, it's just me and an artist and a musician, just like planned, except the musician also does sound now because sound's actually important in Closed Castles, and I've never done that before. So there's the three of us, and then I go to PAX and I show off the game, and someone's like, oh, hey, is there networking for multiplayer? And I'm like, I don't know how to do that, so no. And then he's like, well, I do networking, and I've made this game that's this cool networked indie game, and you should hire me to network your game. And I'm like, all right, cool. And I took his card. And it might come to the point where I'm looking at all these design decisions, like, this game just won't work without online multiplayer, at which point I will call him and add him to the team. And then I'm showing it off at another at GDC Next that just happened. And then a guy has been playing this game really hardcore and playing Closed Castles over and over and over again. And eventually he comes up to me. He's like, I did the AI on the Connect that'll understand your voice and all the neural networks for that. And your game should have neural networks. And can I do the AI for your game? And fun fact, my game will need AI because I want a single player version. I won't release on PC until there's a single player version. I might have to reach out to him and be like, hey, make the AI for my game, and try not to make it like crazy complicated like you're talking about. So I might go up to 5, hopefully not more than that because I can't handle that.
So the team size will get bigger, and you think as long as you have your toe in all those ponds, I don't know the metaphor for this, but as long as you feel like it's best to have different people who are expert at these different things, as long as you are regularly in touch with them and communicating.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to be. I want to be in the middle. I want to be in the middle of the whole diagram. I don't know what that means. But it's just that I like touching all the parts of the game, and so I want to be involved, and that's why. And
so one of the things I thought you talked that was interesting about your talk is when you talk about in Threes that there are rules that you don't explain, that high-level players figure out over time. That seems problematic in a multiplayer game to me. How are you doing that in Closed Castles? Is that something that you want to encourage? Is that something that you see as something you can balance where it's just you're a better player because you know these rules and other people don't?
It's definitely a problem. And I'm starting to feel exactly what you're talking about, which I didn't even think about. Like, for example, when you sell your building, you get some of the money back in Closed Castles, and people were doing advanced players are doing a strategy where their building would almost die, and then they would sell they would sell it back and then get all the money back, and it was a really advanced tactic, and it let them win more games. And then the other, like my other playtesters at Glitch City, would like learn that and then start doing it themselves. And then there was this really interesting gameplay happening because they were selling buildings that like right before they died, and it had this whole new dynamic. But it scared me a lot because it's basically invisible. Like a new player watching the game just won't see what's happening, and it will, and then they'll lose and they don't know why and they don't know what they did wrong. So it's absolutely a problem, and I'm not sure quite how to address it yet. I think that Closed Castles will be the most fun if you play the single player and then like sort of learn like all the intricacies of the game. I still want to pick up and play a bowl, but hopefully players will teach their friends like, oh, this is what I'm doing to make this happen. So yeah, it's definitely a good question. Is
the plan like for the single player mode to support enough that if you've made it all the way through the single player mode, you have to know all those rules in order to beat the single player mode?
I mean, that's the idea. Or like, and if you don't know those rules, you figured out something really good that will still let you get through it.
Right. All right, let's open up to some questions. Questions from the audience. We got one up here, Mike Runner. Or actually, I guess we can go to Chris Bell because.
So yeah, that was a great talk. I love your Venn diagrams.
Thank you.
It was really funny. How are you answering that question with the selling the buildings before they die? Are you like making them cost less as they get attacked, or how do you solve that problem?
Basically, so as buildings get damaged, a red bar goes up and shows how close to death it is. And basically what I'm doing is you always get half the money back when you refund, because in StarCraft it's 75%, which annoys me. It's a very complicated percentage of how much. So you get half back. Like half what you spend, you get back. But as it takes damage, then you do get and so if it's a building, most buildings have 4 health. So it'll get a quarter back. If it only has 1 damage, you'll get, and so on and so forth. So it does affect it, and it's actually worked out, and now people can't abuse the system, which is the main goal of that.
Neat.
Very minimalist.
Thank you.
Not a question. Why would have been better?
Neat?
Next question.
Oh no, it's David. He works at Riot. I talked about Riot.
So with your solution to that selling problem, it seems like you've just made it less advantageous to still want to sell it. Like, I have to sell that building to make an optimum decision, even if it just gives me like 10 gold instead of like 50.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you still want to allow that level of micro invisible play?
Well, because players want to sell their buildings, and I don't want to get in their way. But at the same time, I want to avoid the problem of that I was just talking about, where I just give all the money back.
The question there is like you're adding like a race condition, right? Like oh shit, little guy's marching towards my building. It has 3 damage. Why let that give money back at all? Like once it's at that point.
That's a good point, actually. I might stop like after half health.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. 'Cause what you're really thinking is it worth just taking that one final HP will also take out an enemy unit.
Yeah, that's true.
You're balancing that, so it's not.
It used to be like clearly better to sell, but now it's not. Now it's actually an interesting decision.
Yeah, now it's like you're trading $5 to kill that one guy. Is basically the decision.
Trivially obvious decision now. It's
Thank you.
It just seems
Sorry.
like it just seems like you don't want to make it invisible anymore. You want to make it visible, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, money will pop out of it. It's not there yet.
So, do you have any examples when you developing your game that building intertwined systems doesn't work and you have to compartmentalize that?
Sorry, can you please the first part of your question?
Do you have any? Is it working?
Yeah.
So, do you have any examples when you working on your game that you cannot like combine those systems and you have to divide it and compartmentalize it?
Yeah. Yeah, compartmentalizing was an option for all the different kinds of buildings. And I think my intuition is that I can add, like layers of repercussions to each of those individual verbs. Like attacking is also, putting pressure on my opponent, for example. Defending is blocking myself in, so I think maybe that's the right way to do it. Like hopefully, but it might be too complicated. Still figuring this out.
Hey, I really liked your talk a lot. I wonder if RTSs are really like the best kind of starting place for what you seem to be wanting to do, because you said that the thing that you really liked about RTSs was like the building, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there are other like genres and other kinds of games that are more building focused than RTSs. Like what comes to mind for me is like Euro games, things like Agricola or something. Those games where you really are just building like this big building thing, the whole entire game. That's like all you do. And so I wonder if you have put a lot of thought into that kind of other directions besides RTSs as maybe something to market this as, because it doesn't strike me as an RTS, even though it's in real time and it's a strategy game, obviously. It strikes me as its own kind of thing, So I'm wondering if, I don't know, maybe you could say something about that.
I mean, I enjoy Euro games because I enjoy like spending an afternoon with my friends and solving problems around each other. But I think a lot of the times they're not interactive enough for my tastes. So this is very like obviously head to head, and also on top of all of this stuff, one of my main goals for Closed Castles is to make it really quick play sessions, because those StarCraft games can last like 40 minutes or whatever, and I can't stand it. There's definitely a problem with the Closed Castles. The beginner version is on a slower speed. Some of you might have felt this, like this is going on for a while. But when advanced players sit down and play on the fastest speed, it's like I love playing it. It's like just super fun. And the roads that people draw now become like flows of attack instead of like here's one guy walking along, here's another guy walking along. And so really that quick, fast pace is what I'm going for. And actually it started out, funny you should say this, is that this started out as like a sort of city building game in my mind before it was an RTS. It was like, I want like, instead of a platformer local multiplayer game, I want a Sim City local multiplayer game is actually how this started. And so it was like, maybe you build parks and then you build schools, and it was like dropping all these things, but they ended up being too abstract. And so I took the lazy route and made it about violence, but it's so pointed and direct that it really got to the heart of the super fast local multiplayer game that I was going for. It's cool, all these questions about Closed Castles. I was not ready for that.
Hi. One of the things in your talk, you seem to be, like, the thing that you highlighted as being problematic in StarCraft was that snowball effect.
Mm-hmm.
In Closed Castles, it feels like there's still kind of a snowball there.
There is.
Are you trying to, like, is your goal to blunt that in some way, or is it to make being on the losing side more interesting, or is it to just shorten the period that you're in that miserable period?
Yeah. There's another game coming out called Lead to Fire, and they're focusing on just shortening the period, like when you snowball. Also, this is all really interesting because I'm entering this new crazy territory of competitive, basically fighting games that I am totally unfamiliar with, but it has all this depth that you guys are exploring with me, which is very cool. And so, yeah, snowballing is definitely a problem because it's a game about building up resources, and these resources spawn more resources, basically. And so it's definitely a problem. My current idea, I'll see if it works, I'm going to try it out, is not to stop the snowballing, but to have a comeback mechanic where if it's like very clear that you're on the losing side of the equation, you get some crazy overpowered superpower that lets you come back, like, and it's much harder and more fragile, but there's a chance that you could still win. And the idea there is that snowballing still happens, your resources-based decisions still count, but hopefully it's at that point it's fun to lose because you're losing, but you're like, oh, but I got the superpower that maybe I can work to help me win. And that's the sort of the idea goal that I'm going for. That'll probably change and fail, but we'll find out. Mike's.
Yeah, but like, isn't it part of like the intrinsic mechanic of the person that's attacking?
The person that's attacking is actually removing your resources. That's what causes the snowball effect. Like, it's an intrinsic part of the gameplay, the fact that the moment one has an unbalanced number of units on the playground, the snowball is like starting automatically.
Yeah,
so
I mean, yeah, mathematically, yes. Like, this person has more units than this person. But ideally, there's still interesting strategic decisions to be made that can get it back in your directions, because there's still, like, literally you can look at the space and be like, well, if he builds over here and goes around, then he can get to the castle first. Because the game's not about having the most resources, it's about killing the castle. And you could still do that even if the opponent has like this huge army, theoretically. So hopefully it's not that intrinsically
I
into the game.
feel that the time is what it enables like this recuperating that loss, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, sorry. I love this turn into an open problems for Closed Castles.
I'm into it.
Which is awesome, and thank you for your talk. Very simply, I wanted to ask, and maybe your answer is just no, is there anything wrong with minimalism as a design?
It's perfect. No, the main problem I've seen with minimalism and minimalist games is that they err on the side of too simple, and like that's hopefully what the layered repercussions like helps prevent. But yeah, there's like a lot of iOS games that come out now are technically minimal, but they're so boring and I don't want to play any of them. So that's the main problem with minimalism, I would say.
Hi. Yeah. So a lot of what allows that comeback to happen in StarCraft is that there isn't perfect information. That the winner, like the person who's on the downslope, can kind of hide and maybe make a tech switch that brings them back because the other person guesses wrong, right? So you're behind, and so what it becomes is a guessing game, and you can win a guessing game often. But you have a game that has perfect information. Have you observed, like, is that a struggle? Like, how are you working with perfect information and players that are looking at a player that's losing and says, I know exactly what you can do and what you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really no, like, we could play rock, paper, scissors, right, because it's real time, and maybe that's, how is that working? Like, how are you overcoming that limitation?
No, it's a really good point because, like, most people are, I'm still playing at the skill level where no one's at that, like, I can read the map all at once and totally understand what's happening and make the perfect decision in this perfect moment. And admittedly, so what I'm leaning on right now is the fact that at some point someone's going to make a mistake. Like if there's two perfect players playing against each other, at some point one of them makes a mistake, and then like that's the crack that the opponent was looking for, and then works them down. And it's basically like because there's perfect information. Closed Castles is also a fighting game. Just like fighting games also have perfect information. You can see exactly what's happening on screen, and so I'm going to have to make it feel like that, which I think is really interesting. If that helps. Thank you.